So I just got back from Star Citizens' annual convention they call Citizencon, which concluded after a massive 2-day schedule that dropped the most information that we've ever received in one go, making for inarguably the best Citizencon that they've ever done. However, for those of you in the know concerned about the future of the project, there were really only 2 questions that you needed to see the answers to. Is server meshing possible in the way that Star Citizen needs it to operate? And where the heck is Squadron 42? Why these are the most important questions should be clear to long-term backers. What's at stake is the very existence of the project. But for those of you who are newer and want to be brought up to speed, don't worry, I'm going to fill you in before we go into how CIG answered both questions. That way you guys understand the gravity of why these questions are so important. But it will also be a great refresher for those of you guys returning after a long hiatus on the project. But I won't just be answering the questions, I'll also be bringing in some exclusive context to both questions based on a 10-minute conversation I had with the Star Citizen founder, Chris Roberts, at the after party, along with some of the other developers I talked to, such as Ian Leyland. Sorry, by the way, if you were in line trying to talk to Chris Roberts after me. I didn't expect him to talk to me that long, but I didn't want to stop him because it was really cool to hear what he had to say. Anyway, if by the end of the video you guys think I did a good job and that I deserve it, please don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button to let me know that I did a good job. Also, don't forget to follow me over on X if you haven't already, and over on Twitch where you can see me live every week. So the massive 2-day event Citizencon this year revealed a ton of great information about needed improvements and content coming down the pipeline in the near and kind of near future. There was a lot of great stuff they talked about, like improvements to hair tech and improvements to clothing, also improvements to planet tech, brand new features, the engineering gameplay, changes to combat, a brand new scanning and map tech, which is amazing and it ties into data running, and even a peek at how base building is going to work, which is planned to be given to us sometime next year. There's a lot more than that, but I'm going to be doing a more comprehensive video on the whole event after CIG releases all the 4K videos on YouTube, which they haven't yet. So if you guys want a really beautiful tour of the entire event, please look forward to that later this week when hopefully we have all those videos. But all of that information is only mere set dressing compared to the importance of the 2 major questions that CIG needed to answer with this year's Citizencon. That is server meshing possible, and where is Squadron 42? So let's dive first into why Squadron 42 is so important, as well as into some of the background for how it's arguably detrimentally affected Star Citizen's progress for the past 5 years. So Squadron 42 is the single-player campaign component of Star Citizen, the MMO game that most of you are likely familiar with. It was pitched alongside Star Citizen from the very beginning and has likewise been in development for just as long. That's around 11 years now if you don't know. It was originally announced to release back in 2016, that's Squadron, not Star Citizen, which they famously missed alongside the follow-up windows that they later gave us, earning Star Citizen's Chris Roberts a lot of skepticism for whether or not they could ever deliver the project. This has led to things like the term scam citizen and the joke that Squadron is always 2 years away, really meaning that it's just in perpetual development hell. Aware of the long development cycle and the ever-growing skepticism, the developers of Star Citizen Cloud Imperium Games, or CIG for short, shifted their focus to Squadron over the multiplayer environment, Star Citizen, in favor of trying to get Squadron out sooner. This involved them changing their development cycle, going from a shared build, which would be separated out for Star Citizen's quarterly releases, to 2 separate parallel development builds that would allow CIG to more quickly iterate Squadron-focused features without having to worry about the pesky quarterly release schedule that they had until then. However, despite promises that this new development method would improve the quality of patches and we would see more polished features coming out, the vast majority of what we've seen from their Squadron 42 demos from earlier have yet to make it into the game. And this change has also arguably detrimentally affected the pace and quantity of content that's been coming out of CIG since this shift, making for less tangible progress for us to experience. And that brings me to why Squadron 42 is so important. Well, it's true that Squadron 42, much like many other single-player games, will likely not enjoy a long shelf life for advertising or income post-release, versus say a multiplayer game like Star Citizen. A well-received release would still serve the purpose of proving that CIG can produce a finished, polished, and properly fun game. Given the aforementioned history and poor reputation of the company to the wider gaming community, it would also serve to rally interest and restore the company's image in the eyes of said gamers. Now, I'm sure some of you are already taking to chat to say with great fervor that you've always believed in the project and never believed that they were trying to scam you, and I'm with you on that. I'm a backer too. But it's really important, I think, to acknowledge the reality of how most people perceive the company in the game. I think we can agree that it's overall not positive. It also shouldn't be overlooked that if the story in Squadron 42 is actually good on release, it could serve to create a whole new swath of dedicated fans eager not just for more follow-up games for story, but also more fans eager to hop into the real moneymaker for CIG, Star Citzen, personally the game that I really backed for. Secondly, the release would help to relieve some of the financial stress the company has been enduring since their shifted focus. Since the removal of Squadron from the website, and arguably since they stopped advertising the game back in 2018, all of Squadron's funding has come from ship sales in the public-facing Star Citzen experience. An experience which I've already noted has suffered greatly since they refocused development. A finished Squadron would garner sales specifically for the game and finally allow it to pay for itself, giving CIG the funding required to acquire more talent to work on Star Citzen and an eventual follow-up for Squadron 42 should people really want it, and I think they will if it's good. 600 million then may sound like a lot, but remember that this is essentially for two different games, one of which has notoriously insane scope. So in sum then, a good release for Squadron 42 will have the benefit of restoring confidence, proving that CIG can make a game, and would gain more interest for fans for the project as a whole, and would help assist in relieving funding stress, and that would enable them to fund development for focus back to Star Citzen. Well, it might go without saying, I think it's also worth emphasizing that a bad release would be catastrophic for the whole project. While I doubt that it would kill Star Citzen immediately, it may signal an unstoppable decline in funding, leading to the eventual curtailing of the project into a shell of its former promise, or in the worst case scenario, a complete collapse of the project. If you think sentiment is bad now, think about just how bad it would be if Squadron 42 was a flop. I can just imagine the headlines. Squadron 42 releases after 12 years and 600 million, only to be terrible. It'll be everywhere, and I don't think that CIG could weather the storm like they have in the past. I'm not trying to be all doom and gloom here, I'm just trying to look at this realistically. Luckily then, for all of us who want the project to succeed, Citizencon ended with an emotional bang featuring a 26-minute-long video showing off CIG's progress so far on Squadron, paired with the announcement that Squadron is finally feature complete. This means that Squadron has all the features, levels, stories, and basically all the parts necessary for its release, and that all that's left is polish and balancing. If you want to see that whole demo, I'll have a link in the description, but it's actually been in the background of this video up until now, though I will have edited out some moments because the video is not going to be 26 minutes long. The reveal showed us several important things. First, counter to the narrative that it would look outdated on release, Squadron is currently visually stunning and arguably one of the best looking games to date in the entire industry. It's also worth noting that according to my conversation with Ian Leyland, art director for CIG, this entire demo hasn't yet even introduced ray-traced global illumination, a feature that was shown earlier in Citizencon that Ian told me will come before Squadron's release and will substantially improve the look of lighting, which is crazy given how good it already looked. Next, it successfully showed off all the features discussed throughout the 2-day event, coming together in a coherent, impressive experience. This was one of the things that Chris explained to me was a big deal, as together it shows why they've put so much effort into seemingly insignificant features like clothing and hair physics, cloud tech, destruction, etc. Combine them together and you have a really impressive real-time rendered experience, probably one of the best we've ever seen in gaming. This art also served to better create emotional connection with characters and scenes, even not knowing the context, looking at just this one clip between the player and a deck crew member from the story. Speaking of the story, while it's tough to judge from just the little bits we've seen, it also hints at an immersive experience that just might pull off what I thought was only a distant hope. That Squadron might actually be amazing and would make me feel emotionally connected to the lore and world. But I'm sure the question in many of your minds right now is when? This wasn't sadly directly addressed in the presentation, but I got some hints from the man himself, which when coupled with a slip-up by John Crew during the ship presentation, gives us a really good idea of when we can expect to see a Squadron release. In my conversation with Chris, we somehow eventually arrived on the when question, where he self-deprecatingly remarked that he's been known to be off with release dates, which is why he chose not to share that date when he was giving the presentation. However, he continued by confirming that CIG does indeed have an internal timeline that the entire company is sticking to, and that it won't be much longer before we get a released version. He very cautiously steered around revealing any dates though, but pair that with John Crew's statement about the Idris releasing alongside Squadron, and then the later slip up of saying that the Idris is 12 months away, means that we have a pretty good idea of what their internal timeline for Squadron is. It's probably Citizencon next year, or at the very latest, Christmas. Good reasoning supports this sentiment quite a lot, too. If you think about when the best time to release a game is, it's probably towards the end of the year. And this would give CIG an opportunity to have a really nice pre-release event at Citizencon where they could take out all the A-list stars to do interviews. If I were a betting man, I would say that next year we're going to see Citizencon in the UK, where Squadron is being developed, where we'll see the likes of Mark Hamill, John Rhys-Davies, Henry Cavill, and likely some others make an appearance at the event. And by the way, I was able to confirm that Henry Cavill is still in the game, contrary to some of the rumors I've been hearing. So that all made for great news, and the question I would say was successfully answered in probably the best way we could have hoped for, save for a release. And let's be honest, I don't think anybody reasonably expected them to release at this year's Citizencon. However, as good as an answer to the question of what's going on with Squadron is, the future of Star Citizen still hinges on the question of server meshing. So now let's dive into that along with some additional context thanks to Chris Roberts. Why server meshing is so important, I think, is a bit more straightforward, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this like I did for the explanation for Squadron. However, I still think it's important to elaborate on why server meshing is different for Star Citzen versus other games you may have heard of that employ the server meshing tech. You see, server meshing isn't just a big unified technology that's shared between lots of games. It's different in each context, depending on the needs of the game in question. In pretty much all the games that you've played in the past, though, server meshing has a general hard edge that's covered up through some kind of mechanic. For Atlas, for example, they have grids where there's a hard edge that employs a literal loading screen when you transfer. For Eve, they use warp gates between servers, which they can dynamically scale, but they're always on a system scale at the very smallest size. Now, for a game like Star Citizen, which has an immense scope by comparison to any other game before it, with entities being in the confirmed millions for just a single server after a couple weeks of persistent recording for just 150 players on a server, the amount of information that's going to have to be tracked is on a completely different scale than anything that we've seen before in the industry. Hard edges are plainly just not going to work for Star Citizen's immense scope. In order to realize Star Citizen's worst-case envisioned scenario, which would be a battle between hundreds of ships, where some of those ships have as many as 100 players on board, like for ships like the Bengal, server meshing would need to be as dynamically scalable as down to the size of a ship. If you need proof of why this is necessary, look no further than the game in its current form where one server runs only one star system. Spoiler, it's bad. This form of server meshing just hasn't been done before, and it kind of hurt my brain to even think of how you might resolve it. For example, if a ship is a server, what happens if you shoot someone through a doorway where that person is outside of the ship and thus on another server? Would there be loading screens when you transition from inside to outside a ship? And how would that even work to nest a ship in a larger server if it's its own server? How does that even work? The longer you think about it, the more you might be ready to convince yourself that it's impossible altogether, which is why plenty of naysayers have convinced themselves that Star Citizen will never realize its vision. In short then, server meshing as the industry knows it today wouldn't work for the scope that Star Citizen wants to achieve. They need something far more advanced, something that, on closer inspection, seems impossible to accomplish. And if it proves to be impossible, well, the result is pretty clear. Star Citizen then also becomes impossible, at least in its current form, which is why it's so important to answer this question. So then, let's get to that answer. Enter a literal wizard, a mad genius of server meshing programming, Paul Reindell, who finally put to bed whether or not server meshing is possible for Star Citizen in their Star engine. In an insane feat, Paul demonstrated a working version of the live tech, hosted on just a couple of laptops backstage. In the demo, he took us through the steps they took over the past 5 years to get server meshing to help better explain how they made it possible, beginning with persistent entity streaming and entity graph tech that we've heard about before, to the replication layer, which is the tech that helps communicate between the servers so that when you're connected to it, you don't experience like a server crash, and then finally to the server mesh tech itself. While it wasn't the most visually stunning panel of the 2 days we saw, it became easily the most impressive when Paul instructed his backstage QA to cross the server meshed border, demonstrating a perfectly seamless transition. What's more incredible is that he also demonstrated how entities could seamlessly also cross the border without a hitch, and mind-blowingly how you could shoot across the borders to affect objects and players on another server. And then he demonstrated how servers could be dynamically shut on and off and sized to allow for streaming in and out of whole sections of the environment depending on demand. Think, for example, how this would apply to a moon that nobody's on, effectively turning off the simulation to free up resources for better, more responsive areas of the game. Given the granular scale demonstrated, it also demonstrated how it's perfectly applicable to ships being their own server. Paul then later stated that this tech has already been successfully tested at scale, dispelling concerns that it would only work for just a few clients connected. I cannot then understate how incredible this tech is. To reiterate, server meshing like this has never been done before, confirmed by asking several different developers at CIG. It should be then no wonder that this was the first thing that Chris wanted to talk to me about, where he expressed passionately how proud he was of the team that helped develop this technology. He also acknowledged how pivotal this tech was for the success of Star Citizen as he envisioned it. After so many years of effort and false starts, Chris said that he and the rest of his team were elated and in tears of joy on the first internal demo that they all saw together about a month ago now. So that's how recently they were able to get this working. On a personal level, I've always wondered if Squadron was more important to Chris than Star Citzen, given the recent refocus on that game. However, after this conversation with him, it proved to me beyond a reasonable doubt that for Chris, Star Citzen and Squadron are both equally as important to him, that he's passionate about both, and that they're both part of his vision, his magnum opus, if you will, for delivering the best space game ever. To put it concisely then, Star Citzen wouldn't have been possible without this form of server meshing. Coming back around to the question of when though, once again, there's no firm date, and I didn't get one from Chris, I'm sorry. It's already been confirmed though that we won't get 4.0 this year, as 3.22 was announced as part of the Citizencon event. 4.0, if you don't know, then is the patch that brings Pyro along with server meshing together. So while we might see Pyro this year, as has already been confirmed, we're only going to get Pyro in a special separate test environment that doesn't have any of the server tech. But given that they have a working prototype and that it worked at scale in their internal tests, my prediction is still that we're going to see it Q1 next year, but I admit that this is probably on the more optimistic side of things. Overall then, with these two critical questions answered in the most satisfying way possible, it can easily be said that this was the best Citizencon for Star Citizen to date. The very future of Star Citizen was on the line, and CIG knew it, and they rose to the challenge in absolutely spectacular fashion. While it may be premature to give them any congratulations, given that the finish line is still a bit away for Squadron and server meshing, Squadron being feature complete and in polishing stage, and server meshing having worked already in a prototype, means that we are on the home stretch for both of these very key features to the future of Star Citizen. On a separate note, before I continue though, I just want to say thanks to all the developers I met and fans who came up to chat with me when I was at the event. It was a blast to meet you guys, and it totally made it worth traveling all the way from Taiwan to LA for the event. I now eagerly await the release of Squadron 42, which I don't think I did before, and of course server meshing. And I hope you'll join me by hitting the subscribe button so that you can stay in the loop along with me as I update you on Star Citizen going forward. I know it's cheesy as hell to finish this video off this way, but I just want to say, I'm glad I held the line. What about you?